So it sounds like my mic is on. Yes? It's a good level. Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming. And I met Henry Hauser and Cindy in Indianapolis at the Urban Forestry Conference. And this is actually the first time I've ever been to Kentucky and to Louisville. So it's been really a pleasure to go around and see your city, which is full of wonderful things. I guess I'm actually here 2 weeks early, right? The scared horses. Many people, well, first of all, I guess I'm sort of curious, how many people here are familiar with this term urban forests? Okay, well, you're really among the initiated, because sometimes when I go out to speak, I mean, people are like, that's an oxymoron, urban forest. So I usually start by explaining what the urban forest is, but I don't think I need to do that with you, which is just collectively, all the trees in the city. So really, from the time that we began to have cities in this country, when we began to urbanize and industrialize, from that moment forward, people became advocates for trees. And Andrew Jackson Downing was really the original tree evangelist, and he was very famous in the 1830s and 40s. He's kind of like the Martha Stewart of his day, like a real lifestyle guru, like how you should do things. And he was especially big on tree planting, and he was the editor of a thing called The Horticulturalist. So I will just quote you a bit of what he had to say. If our ancestors found it necessary to cut down vast forests, it is all the more needful that their descendants should plant trees. The first duty of an inhabitant of forlorn neighborhoods is to use all possible influence to have the streets planted with trees. So you'll notice I am from Baltimore, and I am showing you this particularly sad photo that would have been taken in that era. What he was really promoting is neighborhoods and streets that would look like this in New England. I mean, he really felt that that epitomized what a city should look like. So very unfortunately, he died at a really young age, 36, in a steamboat accident in 1852. So the most prominent, sort of most famous promoter of the necessity of trees, and especially where people lived, died in an untimely fashion. So you will not be surprised to know that after 1852, we were really preoccupied with everything leading up to and the Civil War. And so the next group of people who really carried forward what I refer to as the first urban tree movement are these two men to start with. So Charles Sprague Sargent, who you see on the top in front of this lovely cherry tree, was the just quintessential Boston Brahmin, and he created the Arnold Arboretum in 1872. It's part of Harvard University, and he ran it for 50 years. And he really viewed this as a tree museum. So one of the charms that I have found of researching and kind of knowing the history of trees is just how cyclical and repetitive things can be. So I'm going to read you this quote from Sargent, and everyone here will sort of recognize what he's saying. He lamented, "Americans suffer an ignorance with regard to the true beauty and value of native trees, which appears to be peculiar to us as a nation." So he was already lamenting that people were not appreciating native species. Now, I should say I have found this really peculiar because actually one of the major missions of the Arnold Arboretum was to send plant explorers out all over the world to bring back plants that could thrive in America. And in fact, you'll notice he is in front of an ornamental Japanese cherry tree. So I always found that sort of funny. So underneath is John Davy, who is absolutely one of my favorite characters in this book. And he was an English horticulturalist who immigrated to Kent, Ohio in 1882 and lived there with his family. And he was superintendent of the Standing Rock Cemetery. And he so rejuvenated the trees there that he became known as the tree doctor. And he then wrote a book that is so modern. He would have been like an ideal blogger. It's like photo, acerbic remarks, photo, sarcastic remarks. So I'll just read you some of his thoughts. He wrote, "I'm appalled at the senseless waste of trees in America. They're treated almost like an enemy that has to be destroyed. As for sick trees, the attitude was, all plants die, so what's different about trees?" And you'll notice to the right, the tree butchers, he says, trees were trimmed in a way that made look like hat racks by local butchers. Now, I should say where I live, the local utility, I mean, honestly, that's still what they do to trees. It's just, you know, some things do not change. So John Davy was really a visionary. He invented the field of arboriculture, which is the care of trees, because it never occurred to people before him that this is something worth doing. And his company, the Davy Tree Expert Company, I don't know if they're here in Kentucky, but they're certainly very much everywhere else in the country. So this is the founder of the Davy Tree Expert Company, and he's just this wonderful character. So the other person who is very influential was J. Sterling Morton, who invented Arbor Day in 1872 in Nebraska. And I have to say, it really didn't, and this was a tree planting holiday, it never really went anywhere until 1882 in Cincinnati, not so far from here, all in all. And the school superintendent there, as part of a meeting of the first meeting of the American Forestry Congress, proposed that they have school children come. So this is Eden Park in Cincinnati, and if any of you ever have occasion to go there were 8,000 school children. This is a photo, well, not a photo, but a print of it. And that was really the beginning of Arbor Day taking off as a holiday, really that focused on children. So Morton was very proud of inventing Arbor Day. He and Peaslee fought quite a bit about who really, could take credit. But Morton always felt that Arbor Day was very American, and I'll read you the reason why. Arbor Day looks forward. It is devoted to the happiness and prosperity of the future. So another important person in this trying to make Americans love and enjoy trees was a woman named Eliza Scidmore, and she was one of these really formidable Victorian ladies. She was a very famous author. She was a war correspondent, and she happened to have a brother who was posted in the diplomatic corps to Japan, and she went to visit him in 1885 and arrived in time for the cherry blossom festivals. And she was so smitten. Japanese cherry trees were something extremely rare in the United States, at this time at all. I mean, you probably could have counted them on, a few hands. So she experienced these cherry trees in great numbers and came back to the United States, and she was basically based in Washington, and there was a lot of raw land along the Potomac, and so she went to the federal official who was in charge of this and proposed that they plant thousands of cherry trees there. Totally uninterested. So just keep an eye on this date, 1885. That's the first time Eliza Scidmore made this proposal. So here is Teddy Roosevelt. I always think of him as tree planter in chief. And this is a photo from 1905 in Fort Worth, Texas, and he's doing what he did everywhere he went, which is to plant a tree. I've been many places where they're very mature, some mature tree, very cherished because it was planted by Teddy Roosevelt. Though oddly, there is no tree in Washington that he planted that has survived. So in 1907, on Arbor Day, he sent out a message to the school children of the United States, and I will read a quote from that. "To exist as a nation, to prosper as a state, and to live as a people, we must have trees." So one of the things to understand about why all of these people were promoting trees as something that you had to have in cities and why this was embraced. So here you have a beautiful park in Chicago with a lot of beautiful American elms, because trees were really viewed as a kind of public health. Why was that? Well, first of all, there was no air conditioning and there was no modern medicine. And cities of that time, of course, were filled with horses, not to mention pigs and chickens and whatever else was running around. And all the droppings from that then came down, dried out. Many city streets were not paved, so the dust was literally full of all kinds of all these dried droppings, and the trees were then, absorbing this particulate matter and just also sort of helping to settle and clean the air. And at the same time, the trees were also keeping the cities cool. So many city health commissions were very much promoting the planting of trees. So the trees were really embraced as part of the whole progressive era City Beautiful movement. Okay, so now we're suddenly in 1925, and you notice we're in Washington, and there's all the beautiful cherry blossoms. Remember, Eliza Scidmore started her campaign in 1885. In 1912, they finally planted cherry trees. So that's 27 years. And I mention this because I think it's really important for people who work in cities and want to make an impact to realize what a long time curve there is when it comes to things happening in cities. The other thing that's really interesting is, look at this. So it's really, 13 years later, and look how beautiful the trees are already. So it's amazing how quickly trees can really transform an urban environment. So after World War I, America, had really embraced tree planting, and the question became how to honor 117,000 Americans who died in that war. And the American Forestry Association, which had held that first conference in Cincinnati, made the proposal that there should be memorial tree plantings, and they were actually really taken aback at the fervor with which this was greeted. So all over America, there just began to be really huge and very, emotional tree plantings. And the head of the American Forestry Association said this: "The trees will mark the remaking of the cities just as those men marked the remaking of the world." So these trees had a lot of emotional freight and significance. I know that in Baltimore, our World War I tree plantings, fortunately for us, were oaks, and they were in one of our major parks, and there was one oak planted for each state. And then subsequently, with other wars, there have been more plantings. And so we have a very beautiful grove. I think in loads of cities, those World War I plantings are there, but people don't really remember what they went in for. And I know actually that's true in Washington. After Casey Trees became active, they sort of realized, oh, all of 16th Street was planted as part of this, and we've kind of forgotten that. So one of the things that I was surprised to learn as I was researching my book, I knew that there had been American chestnut trees, and I knew that they had largely disappeared through the blight. What I didn't realize is what a huge presence they were in American cities. And of course, the American chestnut has a certain range. Did American chestnuts come down this far? Yes, okay. So what I discovered is that most cities, their parks had thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of these really big, huge, beautiful trees. And so this whole chestnutting, gathering of chestnuts in the fall was really, like a kind of big urban festival event. And the chestnut blight was discovered and identified in New York in 1904, and trees the size of what you're seeing in this picture from Philadelphia, within 2 years, these trees would be dead. The blight was so virulent. So this was really America's first great eco-disaster, but it was restricted to the range of the American chestnut. And by the 1930s, really the chestnut was gone. And many of you may be familiar with American Chestnut Foundation. They've been working away in really, I'd say in the last half century to see if they can manage to get chestnut trees that can survive. And they're not there yet, but they're working on it. Let's see now, why is this not going forward? Oh, there it goes. So Americans embraced the idea of the importance of trees in cities, and to a great extent, what was favored was the American elm. And this is actually a photo from Baltimore, from a street not that far from me. And so you began to have these, very beautiful canopies. And you see the sort of the architecture of the elms is really suitable. This is a photo I took in Sacramento where they, still have some of their American elms. Americans really just love the elm, and not only were these sort of wonderful, cathedrals of shade, there were also these historic trees. So this is the way people felt about these trees. When you came into any town, the landscape changed. You entered this kind of forest with 100-foot arches. The shadows changed. Everything seemed very reverent. There was a certain serenity, a certain calmness. So if you talk to people, who grew up before the elms disappeared, they really were just such a part of that urban fabric, and such a beautifying and sort of calming and almost spiritual part. And every community tended to have one or more historic elms, because again, if you look at them, they really had a sort of a civic presence, and they're very terrific for gathering under. And these trees often had been around for hundreds of years, and so important things had happened under them. Very typically, at least up north, George Washington had been there. So it was a very sad thing when Dutch elm disease arrived in the 1930s on the East Coast, and in the coming decades. You see here the Weatherfield elm that was gone by 1953. So very slowly but surely, Dutch elm disease just rolled across the country. And you see this picture from Illinois, and again, I will read you what someone wrote about this. As the elms came down, you started to notice the severity of things. The wires, the utility poles, the cracks in the hot pavement, which no longer was bathed in shadows. So the other thing about this is, if you kind of look at the timing it was really after World War II that the loss of the elms really rolled out, which is also when cities began to suffer from the fact that all of these highways were built, people started heading out to the suburbs, and I would say that the loss of the trees really was really a factor in people abandoning cities, because you look at, well, there was this and then there was this. And I've had people tell me that they would move from their neighborhoods, after the trees all went, because it was just really almost too painful. So here we are, exactly a century later, back in Cincinnati, once again, wondering about trees. And so this is really the beginning of the second urban forestry crusade. And this scientist, Rowan Roundtree, is really, really key to this effort. If you were in the timber industry, you could answer any question about the trees that were out in your forest. And what Roundtree, who was a U.S. Forest Service scientist, realized is that no one could tell you anything about the trees in the urban forest, or even think about them in that way. So there were just such basic questions that were unanswered. What was a tree or a whole urban forest worth? What was the structure and character of a whole urban forest? What percentage of it might be elms? What percentage of it might be oaks? How old were they? Did trees really clean the air? How much money did they save in energy costs? If it rained really hard, how much of that stormwater did a big oak tree absorb? No one knew the answers to any of these questions. So he's at this conference, and he is going to be one of the most important people for the future of urban forestry. The other really important person at this conference was this guy, Andy Lipkiss. You see him here with his beard, because he was an entirely new kind of tree lover. He was not in any way a professional. He was a charismatic baby boomer flower child from out in LA, and he fell in love with tree planting at age 15. And unlike, I would have to say, the whole professional world of, foresters, he instinctively understood how to cast trees and tree planting as hip, as a glamorous way to heal cities, and he totally understood marketing. This is a guy who was on Johnny Carson talking about trees, which I don't think you could have said about any other person in the world of urban forestry, or even forestry. Tree people would serve as really a highly influential grassroots model. It really made ordinary tree-loving people realize that they could take the situation in their own hands and really change what their cities looked like and what was happening there. So Lipkiss and Rowan Roundtree are just really pivotal figures in urban forestry as it moves forward. And Rowan Roundtree had two outstanding graduate students, David Nowak and Greg McPherson. And what happened is in the 1990s, Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago, the second Daley, is a huge tree lover, was under an EPA mandate, like lots of other cities, to clean the city's air. And he asked his chief arborist, well, don't trees clean the air? And she said, well, we don't really have an answer to that, but we could get an answer because there are scientists working on this, and if we could get the funding, they could come here and do their research. So Daley got $1 million, and Rowan Roundtree set up the Chicago Urban Forest Climate Project, and McPherson and Nowak moved there with a variety of other peoples, and they began laying the foundation for the science of what today is all embodied in a software platform known as iTree. It's free, it's on the internet, and it calculates the benefits of trees. All those questions I was reading before, and many, many, many more, are now you can get answers. And this was really the beginning of being able to argue that trees and urban forests serve as green infrastructure and perform numerous important and really valuable services. And the answer is yes, trees do clean the air. Okay. Why is this not quite? There we go. So what happens is so they did this project, and they were really excited because if there was anyone who knew how to get attention in America, it was Mayor Daley. And so they thought, this is going to be great, we're going to do this, he's going to embrace it, he's going to make it famous. That just didn't happen, and to this day, no one really knows why. But they just the Daley administration just acted as if, they didn't know anything about this, and it just sort of, was quietly ignored. But the scientists pressed on because they had a lot of research they needed to do, and they really needed to be able to specialize for all these different localities and climates changes. Not changes, but different regional climates. I mean, what works for trees and the value of trees for New York is going to be very different for what it is in Tucson. So they spent the next 10 years really working on this science. And I was amazed to discover that one of the main scientists working with Greg McPherson, an ecologist named Paula Pepper, she spent almost 2 years with various helpers and stripped the leaves, every single leaf off the canopy of almost 100 mature specimens of 14 common species of urban trees. One of which is the much maligned Bradford pear. And so here's the answer. If you're looking at a 9-year-old Bradford pear, there's almost 90,000 leaves on it. So one of the things that Pepper says is, she says, the first couple of years I had permanently sore thumbs. I really hate cherry trees. They did not want to get rid of their leaves. And oak trees, it is phenomenal the number of leaves an oak tree has. In any case, so Pepper was leading these teams in reference cities as they collected 30 pieces of data on each of 1,000 street trees. And so that gave them this sample that allowed them to develop the science and technology for much more sophisticated analysis of the benefits of street trees. So what happened is they were just doing this in a variety of cities, and they were getting to the end, and they were going to do their Northeast region city. And in March of 2005, they arrived in New York, and their plan was to use Queens as their reference city for the Northeast. So the New York's Forestry Division had been conducting a tree inventory of all of the city's 600,000 street trees. And that's really what McPherson would always focus on. His data is very much about street trees. And they asked, the New Yorkers asked McPherson and Pepper if they would figure out the benefits not just for Queens, but all of the city's 600,000 street trees. And they realized that this was, once again, potentially a great opportunity, and so they did this. And they issued a full report, which has the name Municipal Forest Resource Analysis. And what they basically were able to deliver was all kinds of very detailed information about what the city's 600,000 street trees were doing. And effectively, they were able to really boil it down to show that for every dollar that New York was investing in a street tree, they were getting $5 back in benefits. The stormwater thing was huge in New York. And all of this data then was presented to Michael Bloomberg, who we would all know is a very data-driven guy. And, oh, first of all, so this I just want to show you is the website. And it's an ever-evolving, ever more sophisticated software platform. In any case, so this is what happened. Bloomberg's administration sat down, they got all this information from forestry, and they quadrupled the forestry budget, and they launched the Million Trees NYC. So I was actually saying earlier today at lunch that when I went many times to New York to sort of see how this whole thing was playing out. And so there was the forestry division, but then they also had a nonprofit, and the blonde, but you see in the blue jeans, that's Bette Midler. And one of the hallmarks of any New York restoration project event, and that's Bette Midler's nonprofit, would always be that there would be celebrities present. So this is the planting of the very first of the Million Trees, and as you notice, Big Bird is there. So Big Bird was a celebrity present there, but there would always be someone, and that kind of was entertaining. So many people have asked me, kind of if you think of the city that's got the most impressive template for how you go about, restoring your urban forests. As weird as it sounds, it's really New York. I mean, they did everything using data, keeping track of everything. They cut out the middleman when it came to buying their trees, so they could always get exactly what they wanted. And they actually planted their Million Trees in 8 years. So it's quite... And a lot of those trees were whips. You see here in a park. The assumption is many of the trees that were planted in parks probably are not still alive, but when you plant that many, you'll still have hundreds of thousands that are alive. And they planted up entire neighborhoods that really hadn't had street trees before. So very transforming, especially to a lot of poor neighborhoods. So I was so impressed by all of this that I went back to Baltimore and thought, oh, I want to join something like, get involved and plant trees. Well, I discovered that it wasn't really something to do that. So I started the Baltimore Tree Trust, which I have to say I never really ran. I mean, I did it with a dear friend, Amanda Cunningham, who was an arborist and had planted trees in Baltimore for 7 or 8 years and totally knew what she was doing. So we got up and running, but we were always able to talk about what we were doing as green infrastructure, as living public utilities, that this is not about ornament. This is really about something that's essential to city well-being and to human well-being. So we worked initially, and we completely copied New York. We called what we did Trees for Public Health, just like they did in New York in their initial neighborhoods. What we were looking for is neighborhoods with very few trees. And I mean, look at this. This is, it's called McElderry Park, but it's a neighborhood, and it's in a watershed that flows into the harbor, and the harbor is part of the Chesapeake Bay. And this is what happens in Baltimore after you have a heavy rain. So all this, we have such a trash problem, and we don't have enough to absorb all the stormwater, and when it comes out, it looks like that. So there's a lot of, we actually now have 2 trash wheels, and Mr. Trash Wheel has 1 million Twitter followers, because every bit of trash that flows into Mr. Trash Wheel gets sorted through, and so people get to learn a lot of weird things about, you know, the trash that comes out in the harbor. And I guess it's interesting because Mr. Trash Wheel has a lot of followers. So one of the other things that's really great about all this new science and technology is this mapping ability, and that really came to everyone's attention when Greg McPherson was asked by the city of LA. So the city of LA, like a number of cities, said, we are going to have a 1 million tree campaign. And then it was like, oh, God, I wonder where we're going to put those trees. We actually don't know anything about like what to do about this. So they asked Greg to come down, and he mapped where in LA you could plant trees. And the mayor said to him, do it by councilmanic district. So that's what Greg did. And what they saw was that in Bel Air, they had a 47% tree canopy. In South Central, they had about 6%. And that really is true almost without fail in most American cities. And so Baltimore had this done, and we had it done by council district. And so the neighborhood we work in is District 1 with 6.4%. And so really what you learn is that trees are markers of affluence. And if you think about it, it's one of these very obvious things. Given a choice, people will move to someplace where they surround themselves with trees. So you've all probably been at tree planting events, and everyone loves to plant trees, and this is, you know, tree planting we are doing in McElderry Park. And of course, why do people love to do tree planting events? Because look at the difference on this street. This looks great. So the interesting thing is, again, I was saying that, you know, sort of what goes around comes around with trees, is that trees originally, the first tree planting event, or not event, but, you know, era, really in many ways was about public health. The trees were supposed to cool things down. They were supposed to make cities healthier. And so we now realize, even though we have air conditioning and we have modern medicine, that trees are still really essential to human well-being and public health. And there's just this accumulating world of data about the importance of trees to human beings, and we have all these cool devices that we can put on our bodies. So there have been all kinds of clever studies where you suit people up with these little things to measure different aspects of what's going on with your body as you walk out in the world. And you send one group of people out, into a street really with no trees, and you send other people out into streets with trees, or actually out into a park, and you just watch the cortisol levels come down. And that's a marker for stress, and stress, of course, is what really makes people sick. And some of the most interesting stuff has to do with pregnant women. So and this has been science that's been replicated in a number of countries aside from the United States, which is, again, because you've got these big data sets, you can look at, okay, here's all the pregnant women, this is the addresses, and we know this from the hospitals and the health system. Then you look at what's the tree canopy and what are the nearby trees, and you do that because you've got tree inventories and they're all in databases. And then you look at the birth outcomes of these women, and controlling for everything else, women who have trees in their surroundings have bigger, healthier babies. And that is important for the entire life trajectory of those children. So something as simple as, okay, I'm pregnant and I'm living near a tree, I can see a tree, I walk under a tree, is going to have some consequence for the healthiness of your baby. So the scientists who did that his name is Donovan, and he's out in Portland, Oregon. He was really very surprised by this finding. And so then he wondered, well, I wonder if you could flip this on your head. And of course, as you all know, the emerald ash borer has been wiping out hundreds of millions of trees in the Midwest. And he wondered, well, if you look at the counties that have had the greatest tree loss, and again, the tree loss has been really documented, and the morbidity and mortality data is very easily available, again, in these big data sets. And what he was able to show is that you could actually look at these counties that had lost the most trees and see that there were many additional earlier deaths than you would expect, both from cardiac issues and also respiratory. So Donovan goes around saying that trees are a matter of life and death, because you can see that, you know, if you have them, it's better for babies. If you don't have them, you are, you know, some people are going to die before their time because they've lost their trees. And what he also was interesting in the, you know, the ash tree mortality was that the effect was largest in affluent counties because they had lost the most trees. So I will just end on this. I always think this is a great thought, and it's Arbor Day. And have you had Arbor Day here because it's warmer? Yes, okay, because we have Arbor Day coming up at the end of the month. Anyway, so that's, I say go out and plant a tree even though Arbor Day is over. So I'm happy to take some questions. This is just a very small part of what's in my book, but it does give you a sense of kind of the arc of tree planting and our sort of re-education, you know, again and again about really how important they are. So thank you very much. So I don't know, does anyone want to, I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
What's a trash wheel?
Yes, what is a trash wheel? It is a thing that was created. It looks, you know, sort of like a wheel on a riverboat, right? So it's got that sort of paddle wheel, and when the stormwater starts gushing out, it comes right into the paddle wheel, and then that goes up, and all the trash on it comes up on it, and then it gets dumped on sort of a barge-like thing behind it. Yeah.
Excuse me, if you would use the microphone if you have a question, that would allow everyone an opportunity to hear the question.
Oh, I see. There, yeah. So
and there's one here, and there's one right across the
yeah,
way.
Okay.
Jill, thanks for coming. I found a piece of your book was particularly interesting about air quality because Louisville has significant air problems. We're in the Ohio Valley and very industrial. Would you relate the part in your book about the LA Olympics and how the gentleman you referred to, the young
Andy Lipkus,
and what he did to get LA, the Olympic Committee, to, well, they lowered the problems so significantly it got within the EPA guidelines. I thought that was so inspirational. Could you talk to us about him?
Right. Well, so in the photo of Andy Lipkus, you might have noticed there was, you know, plant trees for the Olympics or 1 million trees. So Andy Lipkus, I have to say, invented the 1 million tree goal. And this is, you know, back in the dark ages before social media and computers and so forth. But the city had decided that they were going to use trees to try and address the air quality problem, and they were going to do it over a 20-year period. But Andy Lipkus said, no, let's, you know, do it in time for the Olympics. So, but one thing I should say is they were really little trees by and large that they planted, and a lot of them were given away. But the point is that when you plant 1 million trees, even if half of those trees were lost, a typical city plants about 10,000 trees a year. So to go from 10,000, like in New York, where they went from 10,000 to 100,000 a year, is just really huge. And, you know, if just half of those trees survive, or even a third of them, I mean, you just have so many more trees than you would otherwise. So it was very inspirational. I mean, people who never gave a thought about trees suddenly were hearing about trees, they planted trees, they were involved in trees, and it gave sort of a profile to the whole thing and that's what I'm saying. I mean, Andy Lipkus just, is a genius at PR. Oh yeah, he's very involved, he's a very visionary guy, and I describe, briefly in my book what he's up to now. So my own sense, by the time I got to the end of my book, is that, planting trees is really key, but honestly, they have to be part of a larger vision, which is, so the majority of us are already or will be living in cities, and cities are way too paved over already. So essentially, cities are going to have to retrofit themselves with nature. I mean, as we come to understand just how essential it is for people to have access to nature, for your well-being, there's just not enough room in cities as they are now to have the amount of nature that we need. I mean, I was very impressed here. You have so many parks compared to a lot of cities. I mean, you're very blessed in that way. But there are a lot of cities where literally they're just going to have to start pulling up pavement. And so the way I envision this is not just that you have, a tree pit, but basically you have a much larger piece of land than just a tree pit, and that's got not just trees but shrubs and flowers and all these sort of abilities to absorb stormwater, and that's actually what Andy Lipkus has been working on, because this system now in LA is it rains, all the water is whisked out of the city, and it's true that the drought has just been declared over in California, but everyone knows that's okay, so you're going to be good for 5 years or 6 years and it'll start again. So what they're working on now, and this is something Lipkus is really retrofitting the city with nature, and they've done all these projects, real world projects, because then you have to see, okay, how does this actually work in day-to-day world? And I think that is the future, that you just have to think about pulling up the pavement and retrofitting everything with as many trees and shrubs as you can. So, yes.
I'm Karen. My question relates to you in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
Planting trees is very important, and we do lose roughly half of what we plant because people are not doing the upkeep after they plant the trees. Do you know, is there in Baltimore something to help people with their water bills if they are planting a tree that they planted for the city?
Right, so let me just tell you, my feeling from the very beginning when we started the Baltimore Tree Trust was we would never expect anyone else to water the trees. We watered our trees, and we paid people to water. I mean, we had a watering truck, and we had a crew, and they did that. And I will tell you why, because I actually knew so little about trees when I moved into the house I live in. I moved in 1994, and unknown to me, my street tree was a huge, mature American elm. I had no idea. And not surprisingly, it died of Dutch elm disease. And it's so sad. I realized if I'd known anything about trees, I could have had it injected with imidacloprid. It probably would be alive today. But like most people, I knew nothing about trees. And at that time, the Baltimore City Forestry Department was just hopeless. They actually then proceeded to, when that tree came down, they proceeded to plant 2 trees, each, first one tree that was dead. That's how bad the forestry division was. Like, they'd get the trees in, they'd sit in the yard until they were dead, and then they'd come plant them in front of your house. So they took that one out, and then they planted another one that was dead. And I mean, think about the waste of money. I mean, it was shocking. So the reason I realized that no one would ever water their trees, I didn't water my tree in front of my house. And later, as I actually became a tree activist, in our neighborhood, we have a wonderful guy, and he decided he was going to be, the tree guy. And I I live in a sort of a small neighborhood, and I think we have all of 80 street trees, sum total. But there had been trees that died, and he would get us new trees. He was really terrific. And I mean, this is a neighborhood of smart people. No one would water their. I would send these emails out and say, "It has not rained in 1 month. You must go out there with your hose and water this tree," because it was not the tree trusts that planted. We don't plant trees in affluent neighborhoods. So I really knew from my own experience, it was like, oh, I don't want to go out and water that tree because, I've got something else to do. So I really think that that's a very delusional, aspirational notion that someone is going to go out and water their street tree. Trees are a kind of infrastructure, and just like, engineers don't expect someone to go out, and clean the sewer. I mean, that's work. You pay people to water trees. And you pay people, to take care of trees. It's work. And and if you don't water the trees, you've now wasted, a $500 to $1,000 investment.
Right.
So it's really, penny foolish. Because it's not that expensive to water a tree.
This would be another good idea to steal from Baltimore, please, Trees Louisville.
I hate to ask all the questions, or too many of them, but since you live next door to Washington, I've got a challenge for you. 5 years ago, I attended my first National Urban Forestry Conference in Sacramento, and I learned from your hero, David Nowak, that 80% of all trees come from natural regeneration. As we're driving through down highways and expressways, interstates, at least in Kentucky, as far as you can see, we're mowing grass everywhere, not within 10 or 15 feet of the road, but everywhere, thousands and thousands of acres. In our public school here, we've gotten an attitude to stop mowing part of the campuses. These are 35, 50 acre campuses, especially on the high schools that have athletic fields. And that which isn't being used is not being mowed. And our public park system here, our new parks director says he can save $1,000 an acre in a mowing season by not mowing in parks areas that are not being utilized. Can you advocate in Washington to start a trend or to save money and stop this absurd mowing? I mean, these huge clover leaves that are not traffic hazards.
Excuse me, is Mitch McConnell not from Louisiana? I mean, from Kentucky?
Right.
You're talking to me?
I know.
Rand
Good point.
Paul? These are people who believe in saving money.
Good point.
Well, so actually, I did not appreciate it, but I was asking someone, like, why is all this, why are you mowing along the highways? And because as soon as you stop mowing, the forest comes in. Right. Well, I honestly do feel, you guys have got two of the top Republican senators. Have you ever talked to any? I'm curious, do they have any opinions about trees? No. They're against trees, or they have no opinions?
Their constituents don't care about those types of things.
But aren't you their constituents? Are you not voters?
They don't answer their local telephones.
Well, anyway, well, let me put it like this. I don't begin to have the influence in Washington that Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul do, and I think that's, and actually, so this is a too bad thing. Really, the way the world works is if you have someone in Congress, politician, so, when you have Teddy Roosevelt as your president, you've got a lot of conservation going on. And one thing I think, everyone sort of worries about is as people are less and less out in nature, there's just less and less advocacy for the importance of nature. And, I was never, I didn't grow up in a sort of culture of hunting, but I've actually come to really value hunting because those people are out in nature and they really advocate to keep, and I also really hate deer. Anyone who, kill a deer, That's my hero. Um, so I've become very pro-hunting. But that's really a problem. I mean, so like this $1 million that Daley was able to get, I mean, that came from a congressman from Chicago who really loved trees. You know, and he just sort of tossed it in somewhere in the budget, you know, $1 million here, $1 million there. But that sort of, I mean, as far as I know, there is no one in Congress who really is a tree lover. And I was actually saying to Cindy Sullivan that I had this kind of epiphany about how truly pathetic the budget is for the U.S. Forest Service for the urban forestry part of it. $30 million. So this really came home to me because Baltimore is a very poor city, and there was a story about a local historic movie theater was being renovated, and that was costing $20 million, and I thought, wow, we in poor, poverty-stricken Baltimore are spending $20 million on renovating, a theater. I mean, and that's the sum total of the urban forestry allocation for the entire United States. So you see, it's just a total peanuts. At times I thought it would be sort of fun to, and I did try and do this, but I didn't get anywhere, to have someone who really knew budgets to look at other line items in the budget, and you'd find out that, more is spent on, I don't know, like mouse traps or something kind of obscure and silly than is spent on urban forestry. So I put that challenge out if anyone can, come up with some really good things that the budget goes to that would seem not as important as, trees and cities. But that really sort of tells you something. I'm sure that, probably just the seat in some bomber plane costs more than that. So, yes?
Yeah, I had a couple of comments. Call before you dig, and be aware of what's overhead when you plant. And I'm wondering if while you were in Baltimore, did you coordinate with any of the utilities to make sure?
Oh, yes, you cannot plant a tree without Miss Utilities' permission.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we're very scrupulous about that. You don't want to get electrocuted. I mean, because so for the tree trust where we plant, you saw these neighborhoods, they're very concreted over. So you just need to make sure that the utility wires are not there, and when you start digging up that tree pit, that you're not encountering that. I have to say I have the good fortune my house abuts on a very narrow sort of section of woods, and then there's a sort of a stream there, and then a little bit more woods. So you kind of have this illusion of being out in the woods by walking out back. And a few weeks ago, I walked out back, and the utility had been through, and they just had clear cut, trees that they thought, oh, these are sort of close to the wires. And I was just stunned. But there's really no recourse because they've gotten that written into the law. They can cut anything, that's even vaguely close to a wire. But I've been to urban forestry conferences where the utility people are there and there's, this dialogue. But it seems like one of these things, a battle that just, John Davy. We've been fighting, same battle, 150 years.
I'd like you to talk a little bit more about what you know about how Baltimore lost its rights to plant where they want in relationship to the utilities. Louisville's got an ordinance right now that's being written, which is going to codify the restrictions on planting in proximity to power lines, making it so that making it illegal, essentially, as a code of the city. And currently, it's not illegal to plant a large tree under a power line. Not that it's necessarily a good idea, but we're about to lose a lot of our rights or leeways when it comes to how close. And I wanted you to maybe mention to us to say,
how did this happen?
How this happened, and are we going down that path right now?
Well, it sounds like you are. So basically what happened is we had a huge, it seems to me this is about 5 years ago, some huge storm blew through. And, in the old days when a storm blew through, you basically were, okay, so now I gotta, have candles for however long and flashlights. I mean, now when a storm blows through and you don't have electricity, then you don't have access to your computer, your cell phone. It's like people's lives just shut down. So people were, the more you're dependent on electricity, the more unhappy you are when you lose it. And so after that storm, the local utilities just got hell because it took days, and in some cases like 2 weeks for people to get their power back. And so they basically said, that's when it happened. It's like, well, if you want to have super reliable power, then we got to be able to just take out those trees, or we need to be able to cut them in half or butcher them, whatever. And that's what they've been doing ever since. And people are really taken aback. And this is as true out in the countryside, the suburbs. They come back and it's like, wow, what happened to the woods? So, at the moment, I think that's just the way it is, and I feel like, the lines should go under the ground. If we're going to be a society that is that dependent on electricity, it shouldn't be a bunch of wires. So I can see I'm speaking to the converted here.
I have a question, Carl. Is my name. I grew up in Homewood. Looked just like Waukegan in 1960, and when all the elm trees died, I was still in grade school, and they passed out Russian olives and Chinese elms to the kids in school. They gave all of us 2 or 3 of them and said, here. I guess it was supposedly compensation for losing all the elm trees. I don't know, but was there maybe some of what he was talking about in that? Because the Chinese elms didn't live very long, and the Russian olives weren't really a tree.
They're very like shrubs.
Yeah, they're like a big shrub. Yeah.
I have no idea. So one of the very happy stories, and it's a sort of a story that winds through the whole of my book. And we're Americans, so we don't like failure. We don't want to hear about things that don't work, but one of the really happy stories and sort of a happy ending is the fact that you can now plant American elms again. With a mere 30 or 40 years of dedicated research, the U.S. Forest Service emerged with some trees that showed that there are American elms that can survive, that tolerate Dutch elm disease. And so they're being planted again. Now, they haven't been planted long enough for us to really know, will they be these same incredibly magnificent trees of yore? But they still are. So Casey Trees in Washington really tracks. They're a very unusual organization. They have a $50 million endowment. And they're like a big leader in urban forestry. They're in Washington, city of trees, and they've got all this money, and they've got a lot of very smart people who work there. But they really track how well trees do that they plant, and they've been around since 2002 or 3. So they've got some time, and they started planting American elms, and those trees do better than any other tree that they plant. They grow faster, they can tolerate all the insults of urban life. So the American elm is back, and you can plant it. And it does very well, but it is really a challenge. Like, what do you plant in cities that can thrive? And now you have this whole thing like, oh, but it's not a native. Well, my feeling is that sometimes it's better it's not a native because it actually, I'm a big fan of ginkgos, which are sort of slow growers, but they've outlived, everything that can do them harm. So they're, if you've got them, they're pretty indestructible. And that is the advantage of certain non-native trees.
Jill, I also wanted to just let everybody know that we are hosting an urban tree symposium tomorrow. It's going to be at Ernst Hall on the U of L campus. It starts at 8:30 and it runs until about 4 o'clock. And Jill will be our keynote speaker. We'll
Giving
have
the exact same talk.
We can enjoy it double. And Joe Boggs will be in town talking about insects. Dr. Fountain will be talking about why it's important to not be afraid of trees and in the urban environment. And Tom Kimmerer is going to discuss venerable trees of the bluegrass. So Please come. There's plenty of room for everyone. And there is a tree giveaway. Free trees tomorrow. So maybe we could just do 2 more questions. You have yours, and this gentleman right here wants to answer.
Okay, my question was, beyond the urban canopy and green space, are there things that cities are doing to try to incentivize landowners to keep from logging their forests? And, is there some way that they can incentivize them to keep their forests mature as opposed to logging them, things like that?
So I'm on the Baltimore City Forestry Board, so you'd think I might know something about this. But actually, I really don't know. I mean, I'd never heard of this concept, that you plant trees and then when your children go to college, you sell them.
Depending on the tree, it can pay for a year.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, I'm such a city slicker. That was like something I'd never heard of. So I really don't know. I mean, I've never... I know that in the state of Maryland, there's a lot of the local forestry boards in the counties work with people to help them sort of understand their forests, because a lot of people move out and, they buy a big piece of land and they don't know anything more than I did or do. So I would say I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
I can help you.
Great, okay.
My family's been logging for many years. They own a couple hundred acres in southern Indiana. The trouble with trees is they have a lifespan, just like everything else. And if you, especially oak trees, once they're about 100 years old, it's either use them or lose them as far as the logging goes. Now, there's something to be said for planting trees that live longer. My grandfather liked to plant walnuts, hickories, and oak trees because he liked the squirrel hunt. So it all depends on what you're using your woodlot for. You plant that, and so anyway, it's got a lifespan.
So I would like actually to ask a question. As I've been, going around to different places talking about my book, I'm always interested to what extent I'm talking to people who are actually converts or maybe, are not. So I'm wondering, is there anyone in this room who really didn't know about urban forests or didn't think about this, but got interested, or, your curiosity was piqued as a result of my book? So, anyone? No. So I feel that that's really too bad, because part of I really wrote this book because there is no book that explains, sort of the whole story and issue of urban forestry, and I felt as if the field really needs it. I mean, any time you want people to understand something, there needs to be just a basic book about it. And so my hope when I go out in the world is that I can be talking to people for whom this is news. And it's actually one of the reasons it's great to do radio. This is the first time I've ever asked this question someplace, but I'm going to start asking it because I am, curious whether I'm managing to get my message beyond people who already sort of know the message. So maybe all of you need to give the book to someone. Maybe Mitch McConnell needs a copy of my book. He's tree deaf. Well, books have been known to change people's ideas. So.
I was going to make a comment about cutting the trees and the right-of-ways along the interstates. Mm-hmm. And in Kentucky, like the Western Kentucky Parkway, a lot of times, I always wondered, why are they mowing all this grass? It costs $1,000. Well, then they started letting them grow in. And they grew in. And
the next thing you know, cars are running into the trees.
Then they had a big sleet storm. They all fall down, they all break down, they all walk up the highways and tear down telephone poles. So now they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to cut all the trees back. So it's probably cheaper to cut the grass it is to let the trees grow up and cut them off.
Right, so the question is, so the issue is
It's a matter
whether
of
the trees
maintenance.
that grow up out of the unmown grass are going to achieve a size and be close enough to wires and human activity that when they come down, inevitably in a storm, as they will.
Right, so
Right,
it's just a matter of.
Right,
I
so, yeah, so.
I don't know if they figured out the economics of. Wow, trichonomics. Well, of the cost of mowing those right-of-ways versus coming back 20 years later and cutting all the trees down.
Right. Well, that was why it was interesting to me. But it's like, why is all this mowing? Oh, because to keep the forest back. So.
Jill, thank you so very much for coming today.
This has been a Metro TV production.